Caitlin Clark walked toward the locker room grabbing her ankle. The entire arena went quiet, and for a few minutes it felt like this game was about to turn into a disaster. Then she came back out and turned it into history. What followed was one of the strangest and most impressive Indiana Fever wins of the season, a revenge game against Dallas, an injury scare that changed the mood of the building, a third-quarter takeover that flipped everything. And by the end of the night, Indiana hadn't just beaten the Wings, they had turned one tense rematch into a record-breaking statement. Before Clark ever disappeared down the tunnel, this game already mattered. Dallas had beaten Indiana on opening night. That wasn't just an early season loss people forgot about. It was the kind of game that sticks with a team, especially when expectations are high and the other side walks into your building and gets the better of you. So when these teams met again, this was more than a regular game in August. It felt like Indiana had something to clean up. And for a while, it looked like the same problem might be showing up again. Dallas hung around early. The game never fully settled. Indiana had moments, but it did not feel comfortable. It did not feel easy. And because Dallas already had that opening night win in its back pocket, there was a real sense that this could turn into another frustrating night if the Fever did not take control soon. Then came the moment that changed the entire emotional direction of the game. Right before halftime, Clark went down and headed toward the locker room. That is the kind of image that changes a building instantly. 1 second people are watching the game, the next everyone is trying to read body language. How bad is it? Is she coming back? Did she twist it badly? Is this just a scare, or is this one of those moments that affects more than one game? That uncertainty is what made the moment so heavy, because when Clark left the floor, the worry was not just about a missed possession or two, it was about the entire shape of the game, and maybe even the next stretch of games after it. Indiana already knows how different everything looks when she is not on the floor. The pace changes, the spacing changes, the pressure on everyone else changes. And Dallas is exactly the kind of team that can make you pay if you lose that engine. So, for those minutes before halftime and heading into the break, the emotion in the arena shifted hard. What had started as a tense rematch suddenly felt fragile. A team that wanted payback was now staring at the possibility of losing its most important player in the middle of the night. Then the third quarter started, and Clark walked back out. That alone would have brought energy back into the building, but the way she returned is what made it unforgettable. She did not come back looking tentative. She did not drift through a few possessions trying to test the ankle. She did not play like someone easing back into the game. She attacked. Almost immediately, she was back in rhythm, back in control, and back to playing at full force. The worry in the building shifted into adrenaline and then into disbelief once the shots started falling. Clark put up 17 points in the third quarter alone. That is the stretch that changed everything. Not just because the points came fast, but because they changed the temperature of the game. Dallas had control. Then suddenly it felt like they were trying to survive a wave. Indiana's bench got louder, the crowd came alive again, and every made shot felt like the game tilting another step in the Fever's direction. That is what great players do in games like this. They do not just score, they change what the game feels like. Clark finished with 29 points and 10 assists, and that line tells you a lot by itself, but it still doesn't fully explain what the performance felt like in real time. This was not a quiet stat-padding night. This was a performance that came with context, pressure, and a turning point built into it. She went from the tunnel and an injury scare to completely owning the second half of a revenge game. That is why this night felt bigger than a typical 29-10. And that is also why the records matter. Not because records are automatically interesting on their own, but because these were the kind of records that made the performance feel historic instead of merely excellent. Clark's night added to a run that is already redefining what a point guard can look like in this league. She now has more 20-point, 10-assist games than anyone else in league history, and she got there absurdly fast. That matters because it is one thing to score big as a lead guard. It is another thing to score big while still controlling the game for everyone else. That is what makes her numbers different. She is not choosing between scorer and creator. She is doing both at once, and that is why another record from this run stands out so much. She has built a pace of total points produced through scoring and assists that does not really fit the old shape of the position. When a guard is directly responsible for nearly 40 points a night, you are not just watching a hot player, you are watching an offensive system orbit around one person. That is what Dallas ran into in the second half, and it is what Indiana increasingly looks like when everything starts clicking. Clark is not just having good games, she is forcing teams into impossible choices. Press up on her and she can get downhill or hit you with range. Collapse on her and somebody else is open. Try to survive with single coverage and she can torch the quarter by herself. That is what happened here, but this is also where the bigger lesson from the game comes in, because Indiana did not make this a record night on Clark alone. Kelsey Mitchell was huge again. That part should not get lost just because Clark had the headline performance. Mitchell kept doing what she has done all season, which is score in bunches and keep the offense from ever becoming too dependent on one rhythm. Her scoring streak has become one of the most impressive under-the-radar stories in the league, because it is not just long. It is reliable. Night after night, she gives Indiana another perimeter threat defenses have to fear. That changes everything for Clark because the more reliable Mitchell is, the less opponents can load up in one direction, and when a team has to worry about both guards at once, Indiana becomes much harder to choke off for a full 40 minutes. That matters in a game like this, especially when Clark disappears into the locker room before halftime and the whole team has to survive uncertainty. Mitchell helped them survive it. Then there is Sophie Cunningham, whose impact on this team keeps getting clearer the longer the season goes. Her shooting has become a major piece of what makes the Fever spacing dangerous. When she is knocking down threes at this level, defenses lose the luxury of overhelping. They cannot sag too far. They cannot cheat too much off the corners, and that extra space makes Clark and Mitchell even more dangerous. That is why her efficiency matters beyond the number itself. It is not just about percentage. It is about geometry. The floor changes when a shooter is that dependable. And this game also gave Indiana one of those performances every serious team needs at some point in a season. The surprise lift from a player who has not been central lately but is ready the moment the game asks for her. That was Tyasha Harris. 5 for 5 from 3 is the kind of line that jumps off the page no matter who you are, but what made it memorable was the timing. Indiana needed those shots. This was not late empty production after the result was already clear. These were meaningful shots in a game that still needed to be won. That is depth. That is why teams become dangerous late in the year. It is not only about stars having star games, it is about the roster having answers when the first plan gets stressed. Harris gave Indiana one of those answers, and the emotional payoff afterward made it even better. When Clark talked about her after the game, the quote landed because it sounded real. Not generic praise, not post-game filler, but the kind of respect that tells you something about the locker room. That stuff matters. It matters because playoff teams are not only built on talent, they are built on trust. Trust that somebody who has barely scored lately can still step in and swing a quarter. Trust that the star sees it. Trust that the bench stays engaged. Trust that roles are understood even when the shots are not falling every night. Indiana looked like that kind of team here. Aliyah Boston helped reinforce that too. Her game may not always dominate the social clips, but she gives us roster balance. When the guards are carrying the drama, Boston gives them stability, rebounding, interior scoring, reliable positioning. A post presence that forces defenses to honor something other than the perimeter. Against Dallas, that mattered because the Fever did not just need highlights, they needed structure. Boston gives them structure. And when you combine Clark's command, Mitchell's scoring, Cunningham's spacing, Harris's shot making, and Boston's balance, you start to see why this game felt more important than the standings alone. This was not just Caitlin Clark being brilliant, this was Indiana looking deeper, steadier, and more dangerous than a lot of people expected. That matters because Dallas is not some meaningless opponent in the story. Paige Bueckers gave Indiana real problems again. She scored 29 herself and kept reminding everyone why this matchup is going to matter every time these teams share a floor. That is part of what made Clark's answer feel so significant. This was not a one-sided star showcase. There was real pressure coming back the other way. So when Indiana flipped the game, it felt earned. And it also gave the whole night a bigger narrative than just records. It became about response. Dallas won the first meeting. Clark got hurt in the middle of this one. Paige kept the pressure on. And still, Indiana walked away with the night and turned it into something historic. That is the kind of win teams remember, and it is why the emotional center of the game is still that tunnel moment. Because if Clark does not come back, this becomes a completely different story. Maybe it becomes concern. Maybe it becomes frustration. Maybe it becomes another missed opportunity against the same opponent. Instead, she came back and detonated the third quarter. That is the sequence people will remember. The silence, the uncertainty, the return, the takeover, the records. That is a real sports story. And it is also why this felt like more than a regular season game. Indiana did not just look talented, they looked resilient, they looked connected, they looked like a team beginning to understand exactly how dangerous it can be when everyone around Clark starts fitting into the right spaces. That is where things get interesting for the playoff push, because if Clark can control a game like this after an injury scare, if Mitchell keeps scoring like this, if Cunningham keeps spacing the floor, if Harris can give you a surprise quarter, and if Boston keeps anchoring the inside, then this team becomes a problem in more than one style of game. Fast game, tense game, comeback game, star duel. It starts to look like Indiana has answers for all of them. And that may be the biggest takeaway from the night. Yes, the records matter. Yes, Clark's line was ridiculous. Yes, the rematch angle made it sweeter. But the biggest takeaway may be that this did not feel like a one-player miracle. It felt like a team performance that happened to be powered by a superstar who knows how to change the mood of an arena in 5 minutes. That is why this win felt different. And that is why a game that started with a limp to the tunnel ended with Indiana looking stronger than ever. So now the real question is not just how many records were broken, it is this. Was this the night the Fever stopped looking exciting and started looking dangerous? Drop your take in the comments.